Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend and everybody's friend, Jane Clayson Johnson. Welcome, Jane.
Oh, Richard, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you today.
And I'm in Salt Lake. It's a snowy March morning here, and Jane is in Massachusetts, in Belmont. So we're doing this over the phone. We hope the quality is up to par, and so our listeners can hear this. But I became, of course, like many of our listeners, I was aware of Jane Clayson at the time as a local KSL news anchor, and then kind of lost track of you, Jane. I knew you did some work on a national stage, and I've been following your career a little bit. But then I was watching the Deseret News one day and read an article, and it may have came across my Facebook feed, about the book you've published called Silent Souls Weeping, Depression, Sharing Stories, Finding Hope. And that's what we're going to talk about in this podcast. So just introduce yourself to our listeners, especially perhaps maybe our younger listeners that aren't aware of your career and what you've done in your life and where you are right now.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me. And I am outside Boston, so if it makes you feel better, I see 6 inches of snow on the ground outside my window.
I feel better.
Okay, good. So a little bit about myself. I lived in Salt Lake City. I worked at KSL for many years. I'm a graduate of Brigham Young University. I went to college on a music scholarship, a violin performance scholarship, and minored in that ultimately, and turned my attention to journalism because I loved to write and I loved to tell stories. And so that turned into some years at KSL, and then was recruited by an agent in New York to come and work at ABC News based in Los Angeles. So I was a correspondent for World News Tonight and traveled the world really internationally for them, did a lot of stories overseas. I was in Kosovo for the NATO airstrikes.
Wow.
And the refugee crisis in Macedonia. I was in Jakarta, Indonesia for the fall of the Suharto government. I did all sorts of things. I covered the O.J. Simpson trial for 3 months. So I had a lot of different experiences. And then I went to CBS in New York, and I hosted their morning program for several years with Bryant Gumbel, and was able to interview the top newsmakers of the day. I mean, it was quite an extraordinary experience. I was on the air. We were on the air on 9/11.
Wow.
And covered that.
Wow.
And the ensuing, crisis and, horrible time for our country that was. So, and then I left network television and network news. I was in my late 30s and had always wanted to have a family, and it was a difficult choice for me, but I decided to leave the world of television and move to Boston, where my husband lived, and I started a family. And I've been here ever since. I've been here 14 years, and I work now occasionally. I guest host a nationally syndicated NPR program called On Point. So I still get to keep my toes in the news a little bit, and I love that work. But the work of my life, I feel like, is this book that I have been working on for 3 years about depression.
And do you have children, Jane?
I do. I have 2 children, a 14-year-old daughter who just started high school this year, and a 13-year-old son who's in 7th grade. I also have 3 older children, stepchildren. My husband is a convert to the church, and he joined the church with 3 little children. I met him after he had been baptized into our church. And so I'm a stepmom, and also we have 3 little grandbabies. So we have a house full now, Richard. It's a lot of fun.
It's I have to turn down my temptation to start talking about some of those news stories you covered. What it was like to be on the air in 9/11, Kosovo, and some of those world events that are deeply interesting to me, and have your perspective as a journalist processing those real time for the American population, and what a unique and an interesting experience. Are there any in particular you just want to mention to our listeners that it's a highlight or maybe a difficult time too?
Well, I think certainly being on the air on 9/11 and covering the ensuing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan from New York, I had the opportunity to interview every day the biggest newsmakers of the day. So it was the Secretary of State 1 minute. It was, Martha Stewart the next. I happened to interview Martha Stewart just before she went to prison, actually. And
wow.
There was a famous quote, actually, from our interview where she just wanted to focus on her salad. She didn't want to answer questions from me about the fraudulent activity that ultimately she was convicted for. So anyway, I think, people always ask me, what was your favorite interview? And I would say, well, it was such an extraordinary ride. And I feel and still feel very blessed to have that experience, those experiences. I interviewed presidents in the White House and
wow.
first ladies and world leaders too. I mean, it was extraordinary. But to tell you the truth, I always loved interviewing the people who were not so famous, who had done things that were courageous, that were exemplary in a very sort of unusual or unremarkable way. And I think that's what's transferred my love of interviewing sort of the everyman, if you will. That's what's transferred into this book, Silent Souls Weeping, which is to interview people who don't have a platform, who don't have a way to express their experience. But I have been able to use my, my platform to help them express what they have been through. And so many of the stories that I tell in this book are so heartbreaking. And the reason I'm getting teary is because I met so many incredible people with 150 plus interviews I did for this book on mental illness. And I feel, and most of those people I didn't know before I interviewed them. And I just feel such stewardship for their stories and for their experiences. And I really wanted to do them justice. And so that this book really is for them. And it's for people to understand what they have been through and what so many of us go through, but don't talk about when it comes really to mental health.
I just look at your life experiences and your life story, Jane, and what you've done and now what you're able to do for people suffering from depression and bring voice. And I'm about halfway through the book. It's published by Deseret Book, and it's been so helpful for me. When we talked on the phone a few days ago, I've served as a singles ward bishop, I thought, I wish I had read this book before I served. I wish I'd read this book, it didn't exist 10, 20 years ago as I first started to help people in my circle that suffer from depression and had very little training. I'm a business owner. I don't have any clinical training. I don't have any real understanding. And so I just am excited that more and more people are reading your book, and these kind of conversations are happening in our family and in our church circles.
Thank you so much. I really just want to say I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing on this podcast and for the conversations that you're having, conversations that are not easy, that are, but that are important. And so for that reason, I'm just grateful for what you've done, what you are doing, and to be able to be with you today.
Thank you, Jane. And just as an overview for our listeners, we're going to start with Jane sharing her own story with depression, and it was so honest and vulnerable. And then talk a little bit about, Jane will talk a little bit about how that led into writing this book. We'll talk about misconceptions and what we can do better. We're going to talk about advice for local church leaders, family members, and those suffering from depression. Love to hear Jane's thoughts on the role of the Savior for those on this road. Love to have Jane share her thoughts on suicide. There's a chapter on suicide that is very helpful. And then what Jane would like to do going forward as far as speaking, writing. I sense that this is your space, Jane. This is not a temporary 3-year assignment into this space. It seems like this is your call now, and you're doing such a good job of it. But let's let's start with your story. Will you share a little bit about your own journey with depression?
Sure. So I write very openly and honestly about my journey in the very first chapter. And people ask me all the time, was it hard to be so honest? It's a raw portrayal. Was it hard to do that? Was it hard to put it out there? And I say, yes, it was. It was hard. But I had to be willing to share my own experience if I was going to invite others to share theirs. And so in the first chapter of the book, I tell about what happened to me in a very sort of unexpected way. I had never experienced depression before. I had situational sadness, Richard, things that come along in life that are difficult and, but nothing that a good cry or 2 or 3 or 4 couldn't get you out of, that I could rebound. But when I started falling into a clinical depression, and by the way, I didn't know that that's what it was, I felt like I was just suffocating, drowning, choking. I couldn't breathe. I just felt like I was falling into a very deep, dark hole. And the longer it went on, the worse it got. And I was embarrassed because I had created for myself kind of the life that I had always dreamed of, kind of wanted, with 2 little children and a loving family. And so things seemed to be going, quote, well for me. And yet I was in this terrible place emotionally. And the longer it went on, the worse it got. And I didn't tell anyone because I felt ashamed of it. I thought, how could I be so upset and dark and sad when I'm so blessed? And, I've been taught growing up, if you just pray harder, if you just serve more, if you just go to the temple more, you'll get better, right? If you're living the commandments and you're doing what's right, then you're living by the Spirit and you're happy. And if you're dark and sad and not social or whatever, then maybe you've done something wrong in your life and you need to repent, right? So I sort of followed that thinking, and when it didn't work, it kind of spiraled me down into a darker place, because I thought, oh, this is on me. Something is really wrong with me and I can't get myself out of this. And so it went on for many months. And I talk about in the book kind of the experience of finding a replacement wife for my husband and a replacement mother for my kids, because I just really dreamed of fading away and falling asleep one day and never waking up. So it was really harrowing and very difficult. And looking back on it now, I can't believe that I ever felt those things. I can't believe that I was in that dark of a place. But when you're in it, you feel so alone and you feel so lonely and you feel so awful. And when you want to die, it's really hard to change that,
I was struck with it was so honest that you wrote that, Jane, that you were actually logically thinking in your brain of finding a replacement mother for your children. So you were healthy enough to sort of think logically like that, but inside you're just in a really tough spot that I certainly wouldn't have. It'd be very difficult to know the tools to lift someone out of that spot. Did it come to a head? What turned for this? Was there a final moment? Was it a gradual sort of, being able to pull out of this spot?
So I actually interviewed the woman that I had brought over, that I had identified as the person that I wanted to take over my life if I wasn't around one day. And I write about that in the book. But yes, the experience that kind of turned the tide was also, I write about in the book, and had to do with my husband stepping in. I was out alone one day, having just driven off. And again, I write about it in the book, but I finally called my husband and I told him what was going on and what was happening. And he just kind of took over and took me to the next day to the doctor and then to another doctor. And finally, I started to believe that my children needed me, that my husband needed me, not this imposter whose mind had been hijacked by some terrible illness, right? And I took medication and I got cognitive behavioral therapy, and I did things that I didn't know about before this all happened, but that helped me take a step up. I like to say, I use this metaphor that I was kind of walking up a staircase, and when this depression hit, I got stuck at the top of a very steep flight of stairs. And I looked down, and there was just a black hole. And I looked the other way, and there's no way I could get back. I couldn't get anywhere. And when I started taking the medication and feeling the healing powers of therapy and medical treatment, another step formed and was created, and I was able to sort of step up and utilize the tools that I needed to heal. So it's a long process, and you don't just snap your fingers and get well from something like this. But I talk very openly in the book about that, because I think it's really important for people who are going through this to understand that they are not alone. And part of what I heard over and over again in my interviews was, I thought I was the only one, which I felt too, Richard, so I get it. And that's why I was so open and honest about my experience in the book.
I thought it was really courageous, Jane, and I had tears in my eyes a couple times during your own experience, and just the courage. I love some of the wording you said, like, in this last segment, my mind was hijacked by somebody else. And I love some of the visual imagery you're creating in the minds of our listeners and the readers of your book on what was happening here. And I think that gives perspective. I love one of your pages early in the book. You've written as an introduction, it's the only thing written on this page, "So my children will understand." Talk a little bit about that.
Yep. Thank you for asking. I wrote this book for my children. I really did. I wrote it for the people that are in the book, but really more than anything else, I wanted my children to understand that when you have a mental health crisis or a struggle, that it's okay to talk about it. Because I feel like if we are silent and we hold the stigmas in and we perpetuate these stigmas, then what are our children going to do when they have a crisis, when they have a problem? What are they learning from us? So I wanted to be very open and honest for my children's sake, for them to understand what happened to their mom. They were there, they saw it, but also if something were to happen to them, so that they can reach out, so that they have the courage to speak up and say, this is what's happening to me. So the dedication page reads, "So my children will understand." My children really were the motivation that inspired me to be so honest and to express other people's experiences so honestly. Because you know what? 1 in 5 teenagers will have some sort of mental illness crisis, and that's not even to mention our suicide crisis, right? So we have to talk about these things, and that's what the motivation is for this book, is to start conversations. And I know that that's starting in my own home, and I hope that ripple effect will continue.
I love what you just taught there on this dedication page, Jane, and I would think that your kids will always be open with you about, it's just more likely they will be because you've been authentic with them. And I don't think we need to be perfect parents to be the perfect parent for our kids. I think we need to be real and vulnerable and honest. And then I think our kids are more likely to be real and vulnerable and honest with them. And just a real quick story from my own life. My dad was serving as the stake president when I was like 16 or 17, and we had a difficult family event happen that involved mental health. And my dad took the whole family to therapy, and we all talked about it with a professional counselor. And this was the 70s, and I think my fix-it dad that, was kind of a fix-it guy, the humility of him to recognize we have something occurring in our family that is beyond my ability to fix this with what I know, and I am going to bring our whole family to therapy. And I just thought that was a beautiful moment in our family history. And I have had just a touch of depression in my life, and twice I've seen therapy, once while as a YSA bishop, just at the end of last year. And I've mentioned that in some other podcasts. And my road was not as difficult as your road by any means, but I think what my father did, it gave me permission to, okay, my gas tank is really low right now, and I know it's not a spiritual malady. I can't say that word, Jane.
Malady, yeah.
Malady. And I thought, so it was somewhat normalized a little bit in my own family, and it helped me just when
Wonderful.
I needed a therapist. But so thank you for sharing your story. How long was this really dark period? Was it a year, 2 years?
It went on for more than a year. For more than a year.
And how long did it take to sort of get out of that very darkest period into kind of a better spot?
So it took many months, I would say. And I'm very clear in this book. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a PhD. I have interviewed widely and interviewed many doctors and therapists and many people and heard of such a variety of experiences. But every situation is different, and depression manifests itself differently in everyone. And so what worked for me therapeutically may not work for the next person. That may not work for the next, but it may work for somebody else, So I think that, again, sort of being honest and open about, me too. And let me tell you what worked for me and how I was able to overcome. And that helps us, again, start conversations and be more open. And hopefully that openness will open a door for somebody else who's struggling, who's really suffering.
Yeah, I love that. And I think being open and vulnerable, then people reach out to you. So talk about connecting with people that are on that same road of depression, and then your ability to bring their stories to life through your book.
So I like to say that it is through vulnerability the transformation happens.
Wow, that's powerful.
Through vulnerability, transformation happens. So what I did for this book, Richard, is it was a journalistic exercise for me. Once I started sort of coming out of my own experience, my own depression, I started talking about it in safe settings, right, with people that I trusted, and I sort of started sharing. I had a lot of making up time to do with people that I had missed out on because of this experience that I had been through. And as I started talking to people, I started hearing stories that were like mine, and some variation of my story. People would say to me, I've never talked about this with anyone, or, my parents don't even know this. And I started to realize that this was a huge problem and a huge issue. And so instead of talking to people, I was asked to start interviewing them. And I took it like a journalism documentary that I had done so many times in my life.
That's cool.
And I started just calling people and making spreadsheets and, asking people if they would tell me their stories. I would cold call people all the time. And what was so interesting, Richard, is that I would call somebody and I'd say, so-and-so gave me your name. And they said that you might be willing to talk to me about your experience with depression or with another mental illness. And what was so interesting is that usually within 15 or 20 minutes after I'd shared a little bit of my story, that person would start to open up. Someone I didn't even know would start to open up about what had happened to them. And so this happened over and over again. And I started to realize that people want their experiences to be validated. They desperately wish to help other people who are struggling. And I think that's the magic of talking about it, but hopefully what comes across in this book is that when we share our story, we can help someone. When we use an experience that's really hard and really difficult, but life-changing. And if you talk to somebody long enough, you'll find something in their life that's been really hard. And as I have discovered, more often than not, it often has to do with a mental illness. When you can use that experience for good, boy, it sure feels good.
I love that, and I love the healing that comes with sharing stories. There was a quote in your book I read from a source that talked about storytelling is healing. I can't remember where that was, but it was so insightful for me. So I'd assume that the very fact that you were able to authentically listen to someone's story and validate their pain and just sit there with them in their pain was immensely healing to them.
Right. I think you're referring to an article that I found, I think it was in the American Psychological Association, that talked about when you share your story and are witnessed by someone who loves you and who is empathetic or compassionate or sympathetic to you, it is the most powerful medicine on earth. And I believe it.
That's really powerful, Jane, because it takes a unique skill set, I think, to be able to do what you just described. But we all are capable of doing that as part of our baptism covenants to mourn, comfort, and bear. How do you? Right. Any advice for people that want to do what you just described for another person?
So, there are a few things that I have discovered over the course of the 3 years that I worked on this book and the 150 plus people that I've interviewed, and then talking about it after. I have really decided that to remove some of the stigma, we have to start talking about, I talk very openly about brain health. We talk about heart health all the time. Right. Why don't we start talking about brain health? That's really important. Right? So I talk about brain health a lot to kind of remove some of the stigma. But I think more often than not, we just have to dive right into our stories. We have to be willing to open up and share what we've been through, because that gives, it not only helps us, every person I interviewed for this book said that sharing their experience with someone helped them, but it also helped the other person, right? So those are two very practical things that I talk in our family about all the time, and that I think have really worked for me and for many other people.
I'm reminded of this quote from my friend Jake Watts gave me. It's out of the book called The Wounded Healer by Henry Norwin. And he wrote that a minister's service will not be perceived as authentic unless it comes from a heart wounded by the suffering about which he speaks. The great illusion of leadership is to think others can be led out of the desert by someone who's never been there. And I think of you, Jane. You are the wounded healer. You know this desert, so you can authentically lead people out of there. Elder Holland has been in this desert, and I think as we're vulnerable and honest in who we are and our own personal journeys, then we're able to heal and help people. And it's almost like the perfect leader that's never walked in any desert is still can be an effective leader, but sometimes it's people like you that have walked in a very difficult desert through no fault of your own that then can help other people. And I think that's part of Heavenly Father's plan for all of us is these sort of things happen. And then we're able to help other people. And sometimes we're almost glad in hindsight that we've walked in this desert, because now we can help other people. Do you feel that way in your own journey with depression?
Oh, 100%. 100%. I say this in the book that I never thought I would believe this or say this, but I'm actually grateful for my journey through depression because of what I've learned about myself, the empathy that I feel that I have now for other people. I mean, I used to be so judgmental.
Same.
I mean, just, it's shocking and sickening to me. And I'm not perfect now, believe me, but I have such understanding and empathy for people whose struggles you cannot see, whose struggles with mental health are invisible to the eye. I love the quote from a young man in my book, Seth Adam Smith. He's a suicide survivor. He said to me, "Depression thrives in secrecy, but shrinks in empathy."
Wow.
And I just love that because, Richard, one of the big themes that ran through all the experiences in my interviews was stigma. It was a common thread running through nearly every conversation, a sense of embarrassment or even shame attached not only to a mental health diagnosis, but to the medication prescribed or the therapy required for treatment. So I'm all about telling people and being very open about the fact that depression is not the result of some sort of personal inadequacy, right? It is not a black mark on your character. And nobody thinks that battling cancer, for example, or heart disease, or kidney failure, or any other serious illness is a matter of just pulling up your bootstraps and going at it alone. You're not going to fix this with work and discipline. Just like any other physical illness, clinical depression requires treatment. And so I think the cultural and the historical misconceptions have led us to this very sort of judgmental view of it all, that this is, some sort of character flaw. And if I can control and overcome this, if we just tried harder, or if my daughter would just try harder, she could overcome this. This is her fault.
Just be happy.
Yeah.
Just choose to be happy.
Yeah.
Keep talking about misconceptions, because this is a real key theme, and I think as honest people are trying to understand better, this is a big part of your ministry, Jane, I think, is to help eliminate these misconceptions so we can talk authentically. Other misconceptions that come to your mind?
So I think stigma was the common thread running through nearly every conversation. And the second misconception was this notion that if I just pray harder, or as one woman told me, church harder, I can just get over this clinical depression. I think, for me, depression blocked all feelings, including feelings of the spirit. So even though I was doing everything, quote unquote, right, even though I was praying and reading my scriptures and fulfilling my church callings and all this other stuff, I just couldn't feel God's love. I couldn't feel the spirit in the way I once had. And so it felt like the most important part of my soul had been cut out of me. So I think one of the misconceptions is that somehow this is my fault, and spiritually, maybe I'm just not obedient enough, or maybe I'm not, working hard enough. I heard that from many return missionaries who come home early from their missionary service. I remember one missionary that I interviewed for the book who talked about her depression was so severe on her mission. She had suicidal ideation. And she told me she'd be walking along the street with her companion, and she'd see a bus coming toward her. And she just wanted to jump out in front of the bus and end it all, right? She ultimately came home from her mission and then experienced the stigma associated with coming home early. But she felt all along that this was her fault, that this was happening to her because she wasn't obedient enough or she wasn't working hard enough. And she felt abandoned by God, right? So I think as members of the church, we face unique struggles because we're trying to fit a disease manifest through sorrow into a religion centered on a plan of happiness, right?
Wow. And
so when we read in the scriptures that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, and peace, and if there be no righteousness, there be no happiness, and, there are many scriptures like that, that somehow, this is my fault. I'm not saying prayer is not essential. I'm not saying here that going to the temple won't change your life in profound ways. What I am saying, Richard, is that depression is a disease. It's not a spiritual deficit. Depression is a disease, not a spiritual deficit. So I think that's a huge misconception among our population in the church. From my own experience, I can just tell you my emotional and mental health has improved my spiritual health, and the other way around. It's detrimentally impacted my spiritual health. So let's pull together the best of religion, right? And the best of science, like we do with treating any other physical condition. This is no different. And that's what I try to say in this book over and over again. I devote a whole chapter to what depression does to feelings of the spirit. because I think it's so important. To me, it's the most devastating part of depression and why getting treatment is so critical.
Well, I've got some tears in my eyes, Jane, because what you're teaching is certainly, I believe, just true. And if I have to look in the mirror, if I have depression and think, what do I need to do better from a spiritual perspective or from being more obedient, then it just adds to my load and adds to my burden as you're articulating versus lifting my burden and not adding to my burden and not acknowledging that really good people that are doing everything right that should feel the Spirit but can't, maybe chemically because of depression, and to be at peace with that. And if they go to church and don't feel the Spirit and everybody else feels the Spirit, to not conclude that they're not worthy of God's love or they're not doing what they should do. And this is just, it's not a spiritual disease as you're teaching. It's different than that. That's very powerful. It's really powerful.
I remember I talked to several religious leaders, because I remember one woman said to me, it's too bad I can't wear a cast on my head, right? Because something is broken in there and I can't feel the Spirit. And when I come to church, I don't feel anything. And I go home and I roll into bed for the rest of the day because I feel so badly about myself. And I just feel like we have to stop this. And I think especially for our young people who may have not felt the Spirit yet, who may not have had their own spiritual awakening, and they are depressed. And they feel like, I interviewed many people in the Kids and Teens chapter, Richard, you may remember, these kids who felt like, okay, I'm doing extra personal progress and I'm praying more and God is not helping me. He's not changing this in my mind. What is wrong? And so, I get chills when I say this. I'm so passionate about it. You can hear it in my voice. I just, you would not sit in a corner and pray your heart disease away, right? You would pray and you would go to the cardiologist. So the same principle applies to depression. Same principle.
That is so powerful. And I love this idea of creating space for people at church that feel differently, because I worry that if someone doesn't feel the Spirit or doesn't have spiritual experiences for a number of reasons, they will conclude they don't belong in our church and leave because they don't fit in, because they hear everybody having these wonderful experiences they're not having. And there's not really people saying that I'm here and I believe, but sometimes I don't feel the Spirit to give them role models in their lives and saying, oh, I can be like that person. And not to hear people that feel like them that stay. So I think that's very insightful. So just keep sharing. One of the things I want, a question that came to my mind, what would you say now to yourself that was in the middle of the dark days, that dark year? What would you say to your younger self, Jane, now knowing all that you know?
I'd say a couple of things. I would, I'd be more honest about my struggle. And I think that's really hard when you're in it, like I said. So, sometimes it's not possible, but I would be less hard on myself. I wrote a whole chapter in this book on toxic perfectionism, Richard, and I feel like it's such a scourge in our church population. Just this idea that we have to be perfect all the time. That the way my house looks, or the way my mothering skills are, or my homemaking skills, or my time management skills, or whatever. I feel like we put on a veneer, and I feel like when I was in the middle of my depression, I couldn't be honest because I was in many ways trying to hold up this facade, right? Of, nope, I'm good. I'm good.
When you say not being honest, do you mean to yourself or to your spouse or to your family or to local leaders or to people you serve with?
Exactly right. Right.
All of the above.
I think all of the above. I think we have to be honest about our experiences, about what's going on with us, and we have to, again, be willing to open up and share. And I talk about this in this chapter about, life is messy and things happen to us, and physical disease manifests itself, and spiritual struggles come, and mental illness strikes. And, we've got to learn in the church to mourn with those that mourn, Richard. We've got to do that better. I think we really get how to help someone who, had bypass surgery,
Yeah.
I mean, we take casseroles and we help people that are physically struggling, that are, maybe having a hard time, lost their job, or they have financial struggles. We do that really pretty well. But I think we have to muster the same sort of compassion and empathy for people that are struggling with these diseases of the mind. And so what I tell my younger self is, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be honest. It's okay to talk about these things, and I'd be kinder to myself.
Be kinder to yourself. Talk more about toxic perfectionism, because that's a term I probably heard maybe for the first time 5 years ago, Jane, and it certainly has resonated with me, and I've tried to understand more about that and what potentially I'm doing as a parent to create that in my own kids, or if I'm a local leader to create that in my own congregation, and what I can do to sort of lift that from people that are in my circle.
Yeah. So part of what I did with this book is I started with a clean slate, and I just drew a line through what I heard from people. So I didn't start out thinking, I'm going to write a chapter on toxic perfectionism. I listened to what people were telling me, and after I, compiled these 150 plus interviews, I categorized them and looked for themes and commonalities. And toxic perfectionism was one of them. And so that's why I devoted a whole chapter to it. It was not a surprise to me, because I'm a recovering perfectionist myself, right? It wasn't a surprise to me that so many women especially repeatedly mentioned the appearance of their homes or their children, or how they looked, or what others thought of them. So I think this desire to sort of hide every flaw, that we sort of hold ourselves up, right, in the church, that we are the example, and we are, people look to us for guidance. And I think, when we have to hide our flaws in every area, in academics or business or parenting or lesson planning or whatever, to put this, put together successful exterior forward all the time without being vulnerable and honest, it's detrimental to good mental health. There was a study I found from the American Psychological Association about toxic perfectionism, and this is in the book, about the link between perfectionism and suicide.
Interesting.
Stronger than previously believed and distressingly under-recognized. This feeling of living an inauthentic life. And I'd have to look at it here in the book more carefully, but as I recall, it was that it creates this negative self-view and a sense of despair and imposterism, right? And what they said in the study was that perfectionism plus depression is a loaded gun. So I think we just have to be aware of it. We have to be, again, willing to open up and sort of shed the facade, shed the veneer of perfection. And I think so we feel like in the church we have to put forward.
Any advice to a local leader, a Relief Society president, Young Men's president, bishop, that recognizes this could be a problem in the ward culture and wants to do something to change that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I worry a lot about our young people in this arena. I worry about their mental health, broadly speaking, and there's so many reasons why. But I think when it comes to perfectionism and kind of being more authentic, I think it just starts by example. I remember a story from my book about a young missionary who had come home early from his mission, and felt so badly about himself that he had failed his parents, even though they didn't feel that. But he felt that. He felt that he had failed them, that he had let them down, that he'd let himself down, that he'd let God down. And I'll never forget the story that this mother told that I write about in the book of this high councilman who stood up the first Sunday that this young man was back. And he stood up in church, and he told the story of his early return from his mission.
Wow.
And he talked about how that had impacted him and how hard that was. And he talked about, sort of the reaction of people that wasn't always kind and compassionate and loving. And he talked about how we need to open our arms and invite people in, not push people out, and understand what's going on in their lives and in their hearts. And so that experience and that example of that man standing up there, that high councilman who had it put together, right? He had it all.
Right.
And there he was, being vulnerable and showing that his life hasn't always been perfect. And he's walked a difficult road too. Him being able to express that in front of the congregation for this young missionary just brings tears to my eyes, that this kid could sit there and say, it will be okay. It will be okay.
And that's kind of the wounded healer that knows that desert and then can give vision to other people. And I love that example. I think of testimony meetings, Jane, that sometimes starts out with the first testimony being vulnerable. And maybe that's even the bishopric member. And it just sort of often then sets a tone for the rest of the testimony meeting of people being maybe not the same kind of category like mental health, but just and those are sometimes the most healing testimony meetings to me, Jane, because they're just authentic and we connect in a authentic, meaningful, real way versus just being perfect.
Exactly. I long for that. I yearn for that. And I think, especially for our younger generation, we've got to have more of that.
Talk about I've kind of got advice here section that you'd give those that are local church leaders to be able to minister to their members that are working with emotional illness. Advice for them.
Yeah. So there's a chapter in my book about, I interviewed many stake presidents and mission presidents and auxiliary leaders, stake relief society presidents, about sort of what we can do, programs that work to educate ourselves about these issues, about the signs and the symptoms of mental illness, and sort of how to deal with that when it surfaces. There's a really great program, Richard, that I highlight in that chapter of the book in my neck of the woods up in New Hampshire. They've developed a formal initiative, a sort of wellness committee, and they call it M25 after the book of Matthew, right?
Wow, that's cool.
You've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me, right? And the M25 committee is a resource for all things mental health, for addictions, for employment, for welfare. And it's so brilliant because they connect local church leaders and bishops and relief society presidents and others to members of the stake who have specialized knowledge or personal experience in the various aspects of mental health care. So I go into it in great detail. I've had several people actually reach out and ask to be connected with the M25 committee up in New Hampshire because what they're doing is really innovative and it's working. So I think for leaders to know what mental illness looks like, how it presents itself, recognizing the symptoms and understanding that a lot of our welfare and unemployment cases and a lot of problems facing dysfunctional families are often driven by underlying mental health problems. So I think tackling this issue head on opens the door to understanding how to help and really changing people's lives.
That's very thoughtful. I'm thinking of our leaders that are just I think of Elder Holland and Elder Uchtdorf and Sister Sherry Dew and others that have kind of been vulnerable at times with just their own journey. And I think it for me anyway, it connects me in kind of an authentic way to them. In fact, if Elder Uchtdorf or Elder Holland walked by, I would feel almost more comfortable, and I'd feel just more okay being me around them. And same with Sherry Dew and others and there's something about that leadership style where they're still obviously teaching the gospel and the doctrine, but because they've just been a little honest at times with their own journey, it just makes me connect with them more. And I think we can all do that on the local level.
Yeah, exactly. I can tell you over and over, I heard from people that Elder Holland's talk in General Conference about depression and mental illness was a watershed moment for so many people who felt like finally someone gets it. And it gave people permission to say, me too, wow. And it was a moment. I mean, I can tell you over and over, I heard from people that I interviewed who felt that the same way, and how grateful they were to him for that moment and being vulnerable. So I agree with you. We've got to have that more on the local level. And that is really my hope with this book, is that kind of the ripple effect of, one person talking to another, and let me share this book with you that I read, and maybe we can have a conversation about that. And are you struggling? I've been there. Let me help. These sorts of things. We can do this. We can do this, Richard. We just have to be willing. And I think now's the time. And I hope this book is a catalyst to help people do that.
I love that. And just to, we talked before a couple of days ago, and I kind of confided in you. I said, Jane, the longer I served as a YSA bishop, the more I just felt impressed to listen. And I would come home to my wife, and I'd say, I think God just wants me to spend about 80% of the time listening to the YSAs instead of turning to my toolbox of fix-it solutions. I sort of got the impression that often the best thing I can do is listen and validate, and even validate if, to me, validating someone doesn't mean I agree with everything they're seeing about the church or their life experience, but I'm just validating their lived experience and not trying to have them justify to me how they feel. And it was just kind of transforming for me to just feel Heavenly Father's impressions on me on how I could best lift someone's burden. And the thing about that for me is everybody can do that. It takes a little discipline to listen and keep the conversation focused on the other person and not take their life experience and then shift it to you when you need to really be listening to them. But I think that's something all of us can do. Any thoughts on that, Jane?
Well, I think, I appreciate it and how lucky those young people were that you were their bishop. And I know that there are other bishops like you that are trying so hard to connect with our young people. I just think it's so important, as a parent of teenagers. I think they have different needs than we did, even a generation ago. And I think that the challenges and the struggles and the difficulties that they face today warrant the kind of outreach that you're talking about. And I just applaud you. I think it's exactly what we need. And I will do anything I can to help further that effort.
And I think listening isn't always the total solution. I think obviously in your case and many cases, clinically trained people. So I don't want to, I think rightly so, we connect people with clinically trained people, and medication is...
100%. 100%. And I think sometimes we expect too much of our bishops.
Yeah.
They're not clinicians. They're not therapists. They are our advocates. They can be a listening ear, but we can't expect a bishop to do therapy in his office, and I think that's part of why this M25 program in New Hampshire has been so great, is because they've been able to connect professionals and people in the stake who have experience in these areas with others who need help. So the burden doesn't lie solely on the bishops. But I do hold your point, and I think it's a good one, that listening is a really critical component to that kind of leadership.
talk about the role of the atonement of Jesus Christ, because sometimes in my binary world, I think the atonement of Jesus Christ will lift every burden. And we've learned that the atonement of Jesus Christ doesn't lift a physical burden like, a heart disease. And certainly the power of the priesthood has the ability potentially to solve heart disease. But how do you talk about the atonement of Jesus Christ and mental illness?
Well, for me,
because more praying didn't solve your depression.
Right, just like it wouldn't solve my diabetes or my heart disease or my kidney stones, right?
So someone said, Jane, you've just got to use the power of the atonement more to get over this. Is that a helpful thing to say, or is that just kind of put the burden back on you that you're not being faithful enough?
Exactly. I mean, we cannot discount the power of religion. And I had one physician who I quote in the book talk about, sort of, as I said earlier, pulling together the best of science and the best of religion. Because if you don't have one without the other, when you're treating a clinical depression, you're missing out.
That's
right?
Beautiful.
If you just turn to science and to medicine and to clinicians, there's a huge part of healing that can't take place because you've ignored the spiritual aspect. And conversely, if you just turn to praying, and again, these are important things, but if you don't use them in conjunction with, the science, like we would do with any other physical condition, you'll be at risk. So I say let's use the best of these two worlds and pull them together and use them in companionship to solve this. I mean, for me, the atonement is front and center of everything that I believe. And what I've learned through this experience is to understand the grace, God's grace, the Savior's atonement, how it saves me every day. It doesn't just save me in periods of crisis or, in periods where I'm having difficulty. God's grace saves me every day. And I feel like my understanding of that, the understanding of what it means to put everything I have on the altar of God and willingly walk away and trust that his plan and his path for me is better than I have for myself. My understanding of that principle has exponentially increased because of this experience. I can truthfully say that.
That's cool.
And by hearing the experiences and the testimonies of so many people who feel the same.
That's really cool. I love that. I'd love you to talk about suicide, and then I'd love, in our last segment, to talk about LGBTQ and maybe a little bit about Caden and Tammy that you interviewed. But talk about suicide, just some of the misconceptions, like, is it even okay to talk about suicide? Does that increase the likelihood that people will complete suicide?
Yeah, good question. Very important. So let me just start with some statistics that I mentioned in the book. That because the numbers speak for themselves, there's been a 28% increase in the suicide rate in the United States in the last 20 years. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 25 to 44. And a striking statistic in Utah, where approximately, 1/3 of the country's Latter-day Saints live, suicide is the leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24.
Wow.
So wrap our minds around that. The leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24. So, more than anything, we've got to talk about the suicide epidemic. When you hear, that suicide is the leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24, our conversations have to change. Elder Renlund has talked about this from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He's also a medical doctor. I interviewed several other physicians who said the same thing, that it is completely safe to ask someone if they are having suicidal thoughts or if they're having thoughts of harming themselves. This notion that talking to someone about their feelings of suicide or suicidality or suicidal ideation leads them to act on those feelings has been debunked by a number of studies, Richard, as well as by those who have attempted suicide and are now trying to heal. So talking about suicide can actually help prevent it. talking about suicide can actually help prevent it. And I just feel a real need to shine a light on the need to have those conversations.
That's very powerful, and I certainly agree with that. It's taken me a while. I just wish I had someone like you in my life 10 years ago, Jane, or 5 years ago. I didn't know with the YSA if they were experiencing emotional issues, if I should ask that question, and I had no training. And I think it's just part of us improving as a church is to be able to, I felt like I had a lot of training on spiritual tools to help my YSAs with spiritual journeys, but I wish I just had some basic clinical training on what questions to ask and what I could do as a priesthood leader, and then kind of the right time to get a clinical person involved. And so that was scary to me. And now when I meet with LGBTQ people that just reach out to me, I almost always ask that question. It's a very natural question to ask, and it's very natural for them to answer that question. No one's never been offended by me asking that question to them. If I sense they're kind of working, that's kind of interesting in itself. Other thoughts on suicide is, because the statistics are alarming. Other thoughts just to help our listeners better minister to people that are suicidal.
So here's a quote from Dr. Thomas DeMaria. I've included him in the book. He's director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. He is an expert in this field. And he says, we've got to talk about this. Talking about suicide does not prompt people to kill themselves, but for someone who is struggling, not talking about it sends the message that they can't talk about it. It's critically important to talk about feelings of depression or other fantasies about suicide, which can fester if they're not discussed more openly. So the chapter I wrote on suicide in this book, Richard, is heartbreaking. It's, I hope, also hopeful, in that I talk to people about losing loved ones. I talk to many people who have had loved ones die by suicide. I talked to, for example, Cynthia, whose teenage son died two years ago now. And since her son died, in her little area outside of Boston, there have been 6 teenage suicides.
Wow.
I talked to many people who lost loved ones, and they all convey the same message, that open conversation about depression and suicide with our young people or with anyone in mental and emotional distress is absolutely critical. Asking the hard questions, do you feel like taking your own life? Do you feel depressed? These are hard questions to ask if you're not used to it. And of course, in combination with getting good mental health care and finding a professional who can aid in these conversations, but not being afraid to talk about it, I think is really the first step.
And a thought came to my mind: if you're a local leader and you wanted to bring this up at church, I think I would start with Jane's book. You could take that chapter on suicide. You could use that as a framework to lead a discussion in Relief Society or Elders Quorum or Young Men's or Young Women's. You could bring in Elder Rendlin's videos. And
yes.
And so if sometimes people are wondering, what do I do? I think that's one of the beauties of your book is everybody could take a chapter of your book or some of the stories and bring them into lessons or bring them into the conversation. Even a come follow me lesson as a family, as we're reading scriptures that talk about bear, mourn, and comfort, we could bring this topic up as a young family, and we could introduce the concept of suicide in a family. And I don't know the right age to do that with kids, but I think it's certainly at some point when they're teenagers to have these kind of conversations at home and normalize them so that our kids are used at a young age hearing mom and dad talk about these sometimes taboo subjects that we don't talk about. And then we don't talk about them, we're not going to solve them. So I really like the potential of your book, to which it's already doing, to be able to start these kind of conversations.
Thank you.
Other thoughts on suicide you'd like to share with our listeners?
So I do think it's important to talk about the LGBTQ plus population, because our LGBTQ youth are at special risk for suicide. not because they're any more prone to depression, but because of the risk that they have of being shunned, right? And especially by their parents. LGBTQ plus youth are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-rejected LGBTQ youth. They also report high levels of depression at 6 times the rate of non-rejected youth. So those numbers pretty straightforward and speak for themselves, right?
Talk about Caden. In your book, I think on page 153, you interview Caden and his mother, Tammy, and I happen to know those two good people, and I read that this morning. In page 157, I guess, you talk about Caden's options as a gay Latter-day Saint and how that could then, as he thinking about his 4 options, could lead to suicide.
Well, I just love Caden. I love him. I love his mother. They are amazing people, and I interviewed them for this chapter because I think it's really instructive for all of us. In his journal, Caden made a list of the pros and cons regarding the 4 paths he believed that he could take because he was gay. He is gay. And I'll read those to you. The first one was, number 1, leave the church, gain the opportunity to have a companion and children, but feel like a sinner. Number 2, marry a woman and together strive for the ideal family life I always wanted, but feel like a fraud. Number 3, remain celibate and wait for the afterlife when, as he'd been told, everything will all work out. Or 4, end life immediately to hasten the outcome of option 3. So you read that and it's heartbreaking, right? And so Caden's conclusion after reviewing that list that he'd written in his journal was option number 4, was to end his life immediately. And so I asked him, you felt like suicide was the only answer? And Caden responded to me, it wasn't the only answer, but it was the happiest one. So then I go on to tell the story of Caden and his mom and this struggle that Tammy describes of Caden's sort of self-hatred, and he felt like the best thing was to move on. He believed that God had made a mistake, is what Tammy told me. And she talked about the years that followed and how they talked about everything that was going on, including Caden's suicidal ideation and, the cruel sort of seesaw of depression that he endured. And I asked him, why didn't you do it? And Caden said, my little siblings, actually, I just couldn't leave them behind. I love them so much. So this story is just,
I got big tears.
It is heartbreaking, right, but it's also instructive, I think, for the rest of us.
It is very instructive, and I think it's personalizing just the journey of our gay Latter-day Saints and the difficult past. And I love the communication that Tammy has with Caden, and he's talking to his mom, and his mom is aware. Talk a little bit about, if you want to, or I could read it, just how it kind of passed, and he did step away from the church, and kind of how that worked out for him.
So he did leave the church for another faith community. He said he wasn't bitter. He said people weren't cruel to him. He just didn't feel comfortable with the options that were ahead of him. And I love this quote in the book. He says, every single story we read about Jesus, he's extending love to people who don't feel like they deserve it. And he's reaching out an arm to people that society has cast out. I know my intent, and God knows my intent, and that's all right.
So
go ahead.
Well, as I've met with so many of our gay Latter-day Saints and some that have stepped away, I invite all to stay, but I don't want to villainize those that leave. And I don't, right. So I look at Caden, and he's now no longer in our faith, and I try just to, instead of judge him or wonder about his eternal salvation, I almost feel an increased desire to mourn, bear, and comfort, because I recognize stepping away from our faith is not easy to do. And
right.
I don't think he did that out of weakness. I think he just did that out of a feeling that this is what he needed to do. And so I honor that, and I'll just leave that at the Savior's feet, and I'm not going to cut Caden out of my circle, and I'm not going to villainize him. And I'm just going to recognize that he's a wonderful son of God and worthy of my love and friendship and support. And that's the way I kind of navigate when someone leaves. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. I mean, I think, and I write in the chapter here, that Caden has confidence that the Lord loves him and loves him not despite his sexual orientation, but because he is a child of God like any other.
Yeah.
And I think that's all we need to say.
I love that. And I love that. Other thoughts about suicide or LGBTQ friends?
I think we covered it. I mean, I talk about it a lot in the book. I feel like, again, starting the conversations and not being afraid to reach out in love and empathy. I think it's just the only place wherein we can truly be called saints is if our behavior matches with that of the Savior.
And then I think it helps us to belong. I think one of the themes of your book is, even though we haven't said these words too much, is this feeling of everybody needs to belong based on who they are. Fitting in is sort of assessing a situation. This is Brene Brown, and becoming something we aren't to fit in. Belonging doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. And that may be being LGBTQ or working with our emotional health or all the different things that come to us, but being able to belong authentically on who we are and be accepted for who we are. I'm just going to read this quote from Brene Brown that you may have heard. Not belonging is the most terrifying and destructive feeling a person can experience. It's not the same as being alone. It's a feeling that one is locked out of the possibility of human connection and being powerless to change the situation. In the extreme, physiological isolation can lead to a sense of hopelessness and desperation. People will do almost anything to escape the combination of condemned isolation and powerlessness. And so what do? We embrace, we value, empathize, and we include people, which communicates they belong with us. And that quote has been helpful for me to sort of understand the road of LGBTQ people, in particular within our church, and how to create a feeling of belonging and love for them.
Amen, Richard. Amen.
Talk about, on my notes here, talk about what you'd like to do going forward, Jane. Would you like to speak more? And I sense this isn't just a subject that if I talk to you in 2 years from now, you moved on. So talk about what you want to do, what your mission is.
Well, can I just tell you, this is not a book I ever expected to write. This is, these are not conversations.
And it took 3 years to write.
Say it again?
And it took 3 years, so it wasn't a short endeavor.
Yeah, that's how strongly I felt about it. There were times I was about to give up because it was so overwhelming, and the prospect of writing a book like this and culling these experiences and these stories and the latest research and the doctors, and it was so much work, and I had a massive iCloud file that nearly took me down. But
I'm glad it was on the cloud, Jane, so you never lost it. That would have been awful.
Yeah, right. I think it's funny you asked this, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I, based on the feedback and the reaction to this book, I actually just yesterday emailed Deseret Book about writing another one, a sequel to the book, because I just think there's so much I didn't touch on for space purposes, and I think that there's more to say. So I'm thinking and really working on right now how to kind of put all of this together for another book, because I think there are more people to help and there's more to talk about.
Are you open to speaking? Could people invite you to speak at a multi-stake YSA event or a steak fireside? Are you open to those kind of things?
I do, yes. I do as much as I can. I have several speeches in different cities this spring and summer, and so I'm definitely open to that. If I can do it and if I can make it work with my family, I'm always happy to do it. And when we travel to Utah, there are occasions where I can definitely fit that in. So I'm always willing and open to do that kind of thing.
And how would people reach you? Could they just message you on social media, or what's the best way to reach you?
Yep. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and you can just send a message that way.
I would guess you get a lot of messages.
I've had to figure out how to use all this technology, Richard.
Same here. And I'm older than you are, Jane, so I'm 58. And if I didn't have teenage kids around, I would never have learned it. I tweeted out last night that I was doing this podcast with you and asked any of my friends on Twitter. And one question came in: did leaving your career contribute to your depression? Any thoughts on that for that question?
Did leaving my career
contribute
that what the
to your
depression was?
Yeah.
Contribute to I don't think so. I mean, I have been asked that a couple of times. It was a choice for me, and I was very happy with the choice that I made, and I would do it again. I believe, and doctors have told me, that this was a clinical event, that it wasn't psychological, it was psychiatric, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't something that happened to me. And so therefore I, became depressed, or I fell into a depression. It was just a biological, chemical occurrence. And part of it, as I describe in the book in very detailed way, was chemical. And, after the birth of my son, I had some tremendous health issues, and so I'll talk about that as part of this journey. So, no, the answer to the question is no.
That's good.
It didn't.
That's good. And I think sometimes that's good. Another Brian Mortensen on Twitter says, she featured my mission prisoner book, President Robinson, in Lubbock, Texas. Thank her for me, if you will. So I know that mission president was really helpful to Brian as he served a mission. Thank you for joining
John
us.
Robinson is amazing. John Robinson was amazing. He was a standard of what a mission president can and really should be. And there were several that I spoke with about this, like
That's
him,
cool.
that were just amazing. So.
And I know Brian did a podcast just talking about his early release mission, and then going back to this mission in particular. He knew this mission president, and this mission president kind of got him to this mission because he knew a little bit about his journey, and it just turned in this beautiful experience. So what a good man President Robinson is. And
yes.
So Jane and I started with a prayer. Our listeners, we just prayed before we went live that we hope the Spirit would be here. We hope that thoughts come into your mind on how to help others in this space. If you're in this space, I think Jane's story gives you hope, which is one of my favorite words in the gospel, that you can eventually, hopefully, leave this space. And it may not be a year, it may be longer, as Jane teaches, but there's hope. And I think that's one of the core things the gospel, the atonement, gives us, is hope that better days ahead, or that we can bear the burden that we have. And there's just a little light, even if there's not much light, that you can just keep going, though there will be a little light. But do you have any concluding thoughts for our listeners, Jane?
I would just say, if you're struggling in this moment, to hang on and hold on, and try to reach out to somebody in your life. There is someone in your life that loves you and cares about you. And if you're not struggling, but you know someone who is, I would invite you to mourn with them and help them and reach out. And thank you for doing that. And thank all of your listeners for being with us, and for having these conversations, and for listening to them, and for hopefully reading this book and finding ways that we can be better in this arena. I really appreciate you, Richard, and you're a very thoughtful person and a kind heart. And I'm grateful for the time that we spent here together today.
Well, thank you, Jane. It's been a highlight for me, and I just feel a wonderful, good spirit about your work, and it's touched me. And I encourage our listeners. Jane's book is called Silent, Souls Weeping, by Jane Clayson Johnson. It's sold at Deseret Book. I bought it off of Amazon. It came just a day after I ordered it. That's kind of the temptation of Amazon these days. And just, encourage us all to engage in these more complicated subjects. To me, my baptism covenants are kind of vertical, my relationship with God and commandment keeping, and horizontal, my responsibility to my fellow human men and women. And so this book certainly gives me insights in how to go horizontal and lift burdens versus doing something potentially I could say that could actually add to someone's burden. So thank you, Jane Clayson Johnson, for joining us, and thank our listeners for joining us on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler.